Dixon.
And I'm Father Doug Scharf.
And I'm Father Derek Larson, and welcome to Sunday Ready, the podcast where we prepare ourselves by reading and looking through the scriptures for the coming week. In this case, September 12th. Our readings this week are from Isaiah 50, verses 4 through 9a. Our psalm is from Psalm 116, verses 1 through 8. In the New Testament, we have James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. And finally, the gospel, it comes from Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 38.
Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. Good to see you, Father Derek and David. So we are taking a look at the readings for this coming Sunday, September 12th, and we're going to kick things off with Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 50. And you know, all of these readings from the Old Testament that we've had the last several weeks connect thematically to the gospel readings. We've been trying to tease out those thematic connections. And I think I'll just kick things off by reminding all of us and our listeners that the early Christians frequently reflected on a number of the prophetic writings, but in particular Isaiah, when they looked at the character of Christ and what he accomplished, what he endured on our behalf as a servant and as the Messiah. And so we get these passages that are historically called the servant songs. There's one earlier in Isaiah, there's one a bit later from chapter 53 that we hear during Holy Week a lot. So our listeners would probably be familiar with that. But this is another servant song that talks about the suffering that the Messiah would endure on our behalf, or at least that's how early Christians looked back and interpreted this passage. So how does this help us this week reflect on those themes and prepare to hear the gospel reading this Sunday?
Well, I think the connection is between the Isaiah and the gospel reading. As Christians, like as you mentioned, we often see Christ in these passages from Isaiah. And one of the things that strikes me about this passage is how embodied it is. And of course, Christ we recognize as an incarnated God as human, God and human together. And this is such an embodied passage. And I think as we get to the gospel, we'll see that it's embodied as well. But it starts off talking about the tongue, and then it goes to the ear. I gave my back to those who struck me. I did not hide my face. And so the servant in this passage is someone who is completely physically present in his vocation, in his mission of serving God's people. And that's a very embodied element. It's not just about speaking. It's not just about thinking. But it's about being fully present in our body, and sometimes I think that our vocation has a physical effect on us that we might not even realize. So I'm not sure that that's the main message of this passage, but it just really strikes me how embodied, how physical this passage is.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the incarnation. I mean, that's, we could talk all day about that and what it means for us, right? I mean, the word became flesh and tabernacled among us. I really feel a way of conceptualizing the incarnated reality is that God is with and for us. That is the incarnation, that God being with and for us. And so in return, in response, we are to be with and for one another. And so, yeah, I see the whole embodied kind of experience and presence here. And I also see how this is relative to others, that you come in contact with and that you are associated with. I mean, the teacher is one who is to give a word that sustains other people. You're experiencing this presence of God in your life, not just for yourself, but it is for others, right? It is to be for the other just as much as God has been for us. So I see that embodied experience is not for yourself alone. We do benefit, right? We do get something out of it,
Right.
But it is for the sake of others.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and of course, Jesus demonstrates that to us in his whole life and witness. And I think the passage that I keep going back to in Isaiah, or the verse, is I have set my face like flint. And there's a lot of discussion about, how much Jesus sort of was aware of his own purpose and destiny, and where his life was headed. But I think the gospel, all four gospels to some degree, um, portray Jesus as one who, at least at a certain point, makes a transition where he focuses on Jerusalem, and his own passion begins to teach his disciples what that's going to be, and sets his face. There's a sense of determination and purpose in Jesus and his earthly ministry. I think we're going to see that in the gospel reading today, especially.
That focus is really powerful too. And I think in this passage, you particularly see that in the last verse is the Lord God who helps me, who will declare me guilty.
Right.
And whether it's a suffering servant, or whether it's Christ in his vocation, or whether it's us, there are so many voices around us saying so many different things about us, about who we are, about what kind of job we're doing, if we're doing good, if we're doing the right thing, if we're doing all these things. And yet the suffering servant here has such a clear focus. If it's the Lord God who's helping me, then who else? What does it matter what other people say? Who can declare me guilty? So keeping that focus. Yes, we're in relationship with one another, and we exist for one another, as David has mentioned. But the affirmation of ourself and our being and our vocation comes from God alone. And that kind of gives you the focus and the strength and the determination to keep going in the midst of all of those competing voices.
Well, I think that's a good segue into the psalm, because I think that's also part of what the psalmist is recognizing, God's presence and compassion and deliverance that he experiences. We were talking about this before the podcast started, that this psalm has a particular shape, right, where it begins with this word of praise and adoration, but then this acknowledgement of where the psalmist has been in terms of his own journey, and all the way to the point of the grave, right, facing death itself, and then God's restoration, God's deliverance, God's salvation, that comes to him even at his lowest point in his journey.
And of course, this will relate to the gospel later when we talk about finding your life and losing your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the experience going here. Verse 2, the cords of death entangled me. The grip of the grave took hold of me. I came to grief and sorrow. In other words, I experienced loss. Then I called upon the name of the Lord, right? It's like crisis comes in our lives to cause us to turn and to call upon the name of the Lord, right? To cause us to come to a place where we see a manifestation of the reality of the Christ who lives in us, the incarnated Christ that is part of who we are. Isaiah had said, the one who vindicates me is near. Well, how near is he? Well, what's your next breath, right? I mean, that's how near this Christ is to us. And I just think that's such a powerful idea and thought of how God just brings us to these low places in life so that we can really catch a glimpse and vision of the high places that we're going to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's so good. Last week we talked about this passage from Isaiah where it says, don't be anxious, be strong in the Lord. And I think this is another passage that's so powerful for those of us that struggle with anxiety. And all of us, struggle with anxiety or worry at some point in our lives. But it acknowledges anxiety, it acknowledges fear, it acknowledges suffering, and then kind of lets go of that or gives it over to God. And so verse 6 is what really is powerful to me, is turn again to your rest, O my soul. The Lord has treated you well. What a powerful prayer to pray in the midst of anxiety. to say, the cords of death entangled me.
Right.
Turn again to rest, oh my
Right.
soul. Rest in the compassion and the goodness and the strength of God and what God is giving you in that. The Lord has treated you well, oh my soul. That's powerful.
It is. And I love how, sometimes you just have to talk to yourself, right? I mean, you have to say, listen, Saul, you need to start focusing and turn. Look at something else. Look at the Lord. Look at what God has done. Speak to yourself in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sometimes you just have to encourage yourself in the Lord, right? And I think I love that part of this song.
Yeah, that's great, David. And to some degree, that's what the suffering servant is doing in Isaiah, where he's asking these questions and answering them himself, right? Who will contend with me? Who is the one who is the source of my identity in life? And sometimes we go through that as well, right? Where we ask the questions and have to hear those answers once again, sometimes within ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. No doubt.
All right. Why don't we jump to the gospel? Can we jump to the gospel? Then we'll
Sure.
just kind of flag James. But I just think we're on a roll here with these themes that I think really connect with the gospel this week, because we're in Mark chapter 8, this climactic kind of turning point in the gospel where Jesus takes his disciples to Caesarea Philippi and asks them these questions, right? Who do people say that I am? They give a variety of answers. Who do you say that I am? And Peter's the one who stands up and says, you are the Messiah. And then immediately following this high point, this moment of revelation, this moment of the disciples seemingly finally understanding who Jesus is and what's going on, Jesus then begins to talk about his own destiny of being killed and enduring suffering. And that's too much for them to handle, right? So Peter, who just got it right, all of a sudden gets it wrong.
Gets it wrong.
Again. And then we get this very critical and challenging teaching about the nature of discipleship. So again, it's never just about Jesus. It's also about the example that we are to follow in our lives as followers of Jesus.
Yeah, I think it definitely brings us to a place where we have to realize just having a revelation of something is not enough, right? I mean, there's this kind of applying it and living it and experiencing it and having it integrated in your life, and all that brings and all that entails, the ups, the downs, the ins, the outs. And perhaps that's something that we too get anxious about, is what does it really mean if I'm going to be a Christian? What's it going to cost me to follow Christ? Because there is a cost, right?
Well, I'm looking this up. It made me think of last week or somewhere in James where I'm paraphrasing here because I can't put my finger on it, but he says something like, do you believe in God? Even the demons believe, right?
That's right.
You have to do something, put this into practice, put this into action. Right. Your faith or your belief alone. I think that kind of could be said of this passage as well, that Peter gets it right. He gets the revelation right, but then the implications of that and how that is lived out, he's still not ready to receive yet.
Yeah, I wrote down, Peter, this is the difference between having the answer and living the answer.
All right.
So we're often very ready to say the right answer, to raise our hand and say, oh yeah, this is what I think, or this is what I believe, or this is, but when the rubber hits the road, those are hard things to live out. And I think that's what Peter was anticipating in this passage. If his teacher, if his leader is saying, oh, the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, right, Peter knows what's next.
What's going to happen to me?
Right.
If they're going to do that to him, what's going to happen to all of us who are following him?
And Peter wasn't quite ready to make that step, although he did eventually make that and make that step and lived out his faith in a very in a way that was authentic to the calling that Christ had on his life. That he did endure suffering and rejection by a number of people in his own community, and yet he lived out the vocation that God gave to him.
Yeah.
Right. Peter's an interesting one. I mean, here he is. He's the one who speaks the revelation, right? He's the one who gets out of the boat and walks on the water. He's the one who, instead of standing outside of the tomb on resurrection morning, runs into the tomb to see what's going on. Peter gets the revelation that salvation has come to the Gentiles. Peter is the one who prepares the upper room. I mean, you look at this guy, yet he's the one who denied Christ 3 times, right? He's the one who here is challenging the very plan that Jesus is laying out. So it's, there's so many times in our life that, we're right on target and we need it and all that, but we also make mistakes. We fall back and we do get it wrong, but that's all right. We learn from that. That's the whole point of the teacher, is we're learning and we're growing to become that one that embodies the reality of who God is.
Yeah. And I just want to piggyback on that, David, and go back and just capture again, Derek, you said it so succinctly, the difference between having the right answer and living the right answer. And I mean, we could stop the podcast right there. That's a great summary of that. I was reading, and I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I read an article a while ago about sort of, how the pandemic is shaping our understanding of the church and where we're going and so forth. And the title of the article was The Paschal Shaped Church. And of course, the Paschal mystery is the whole story of passion, death, resurrection, and even empowerment by the Spirit, right? That whole season of Easter that we go through. And the author was the Bishop Jeffrey Lee, the former Bishop of Chicago. And he basically says that this is the shape of the whole Christian life, right? Of passion, death, resurrection, new life. And we don't go through it just once. We go through it over and over and over again. And the church right now, in some ways, is going through a death and resurrection process. At some level through this pandemic, or at least kind of rediscovering that shape of who we are, what we have to let go of in order to embrace what is next. So all of these readings this week, from Isaiah to the Psalm to the Gospel, to me, have that shape, right? That Paschal shape of death, resurrection, and new life. So I think this call to discipleship and to lose our life in order to gain it and to become servants is really about embracing that reality and not denying it or seeing it as a anomaly that we should suffer, but that is the shape of the Christian life over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and he goes on and he begins to talk about picking up the cross. And I always like this kind of equation that is laid out here. If you find your life, you lose it. If you lose your life, you find it. Either way, you have to lose a life, right? I mean, you're going to lose a life somewhere in this equation. And it's really saying, if you really want this life over here, you've got to let go of the life that you've been living, with whatever that may mean. It's not talking about necessarily physical life. Whatever lifestyle, whatever way that you equate your livelihood with things, if you want to live at a higher level, you're going to have to let go. You're going to have to lose it to gain another life that's found certainly in Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, James, we're going to move on to James chapter 3. And I've sort of been seeing these readings from James as less connected thematically, but as we're talking, the more I'm thinking that the letter of James really is kind of the nitty gritty of how we walk this out, right? In terms of a life completely given over to Christ. James sometimes get criticized because we don't get as much gospel per se, sort of believe the good news. We get a lot of moral exhortations and instructions and kind of wisdom. But I think that's the point, right? That this was written to a community that apparently knew the gospel. They were living that out, and James is giving them very, very strong teaching about what that means in relationships, in how they talk to one another, in how they care for those on the margins of society. I mean, he's calling them out and saying, if you're really going to live this kind of life that Jesus told you to live, this is what it's going to look like.
And I can't help, maybe I'm imagining a connection here, but I can't help but think about how this whole section is about the power of the tongue, the power of the words that we say. And here in the Gospel of Mark, Peter says something to Jesus, and Jesus has a very strong reaction. Get behind me, Satan. And I think it's a recognition that the words that Peter say are powerful. We saw this in last week's gospel as well. Father Doug and I were talking about how it's kind of interesting that in last week's gospel, where you have the woman from Tyre, the Syrophoenician woman, and in this week's gospel, Peter, you have two cases of people that are contradicting the words of Jesus.
Right.
And one is sort of rewarded for it, and one is sort of criticized for it, critiqued for it. But I think in both the cases, they demonstrate how powerful our words are. And so that's a very loose connection, but it's another example, I think, of this passage in James where we're looking at the power of the tongue. And we ought to take seriously the things that we say, especially to one another. This line here, with the tongue we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. What a great reminder that is, that every single person you see, every single person you look at, the person that cuts you off in the car in front of you, and the person in the grocery store, the person who's wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, depending on how you think about that. All of these people around us are made in the likeness and image of God. And when we curse them, we're cursing the likeness of God. We're cursing what God has created and called good. That is a refrain that we ought to remember more, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, we are all, everyone, great, small, good, bad, what have you, are bearers of the Imago Dei, the image of God. And recognizing that in one another is so important.
Well, Derek, I think that's a great connection to the gospel. I just want to pick that back up, because in the gospel reading itself, Peter says, "You are the Messiah," and then in the very next breath rebukes Jesus when he begins to tell him what that means. Right. So again, the same tongue gets it right and gets it wrong in the same passage. I think that might be a connection more real than you were thinking. Yeah. But back to James. I mean, this is a passage for our time. I think he gets it right in so many ways. The image of the ship that is so large, and yet the tiniest rudder can turn this big ship. And we're seeing that in our society, right? Sure. One Twitter message, 140 characters or whatever it is, can have the power to, get thousands of people to respond and riled up, whatever the topic might be. So the power of words, and that's kind of one of my concerns with social media, is all of these words being put out there with very little accountability, very little, sort of relational connection. They're just kind of put out there for people to respond to. In some cases, that's really good. In other cases, it's really dangerous. And I think it goes back to the exhortations from James.
Yeah, I would love to see this passage kind of rewritten and paraphrased to use Twitter.
Yeah, I just thought about that. I totally was thinking about that this week.
Yeah, I think that'd be
Yeah.
really cool. And I think it would be really applicable, and it would really drive it home for us in the world that we live in today.
Someone should do that because I'm
Should.
teaching we're doing a Bible study on James starting tomorrow, everybody who's listening.
That's funny.
And I thought, yes, we need to, just wherever it says tongue, put Twitter or Facebook.
Twitter is a fire.
Instagram. Yeah, that's good.
How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, right? I mean, I just think all of the images here are just right on point. They're written 2,000 years ago, but it just speaks to our time in so many ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it connects with Isaiah, as we noted maybe earlier. It's, communication, words. How do we talk? How do we communicate? Do we communicate effectively? Are we talking? I mean, there's some folks who just don't even want to talk.
Right. Well, I think we should stop it there. Thank you to David and Derek, and thanks for listening this week. We'll see you on Sunday, either in person or online. And we hope our reflections today have helped you to be ready to hear God's word and to be Sunday ready. See you soon.